I am the daughter of the richest man in Haicheng. I hold real power in my hands. My ex-boyfriend's company is in trouble to steal my project. He specifically sent a male model to me. He wants to influence my decision this way. I wasn't swayed by his words. He joked with a smile. I see that Alexander is still as charming as ever. Why don't you try it yourself? The next day after the meeting, I returned to the office. I saw 32-year-old Alexander wearing sexy clothes. He was sitting awkwardly on the sofa, posing. I held back my laughter. I waved my hand to send away the surprised employees behind me. Alexander was both embarrassed and angry. Alina. I grabbed his belt, pulling him closer. I stuffed a room card into his collar. Say it. The project is yours. You belong to me. What do you think? I walked out of the bathroom. I saw Alexander sitting straight on the edge of the bed. He was tightly pursing his lips. The corners of my eyes were slightly red. He looked like an inexperienced college student brought here against his will. I smiled faintly. While drying my hair with a towel, I walked up to him. I handed him the hairdryer from the nightstand. He glanced up at me and still took it. The warm wind blew over the back of my head. His fingers gently combed through my hair. The movement was very gentle. I comfortably leaned against the carpet in front of Alexander. Suddenly, memories from 3 years ago came to mind. Back then, I was not the respected Alina everyone knows. I was just the illegitimate daughter recently brought back to the Johnson family at the Johnson family's recognition banquet. I wore a dress that was too long. I almost fell down the stairs. Injuring myself would have been a small matter, but if I embarrassed the Johnson family, I feared it would cause a lot of trouble. At that critical moment, Alexander appeared. He steadied me as I stumbled down a few steps. Many people nearby are whispering. She is just like her mother, who works as an escort. She has a beautiful face. She always seizes the opportunity to showcase herself. Imposters and true heiresses are simply not the same. Just look at Miss Elizabeth. Now look at her. The difference between these young ladies is significant. A mountain chicken is still a mountain chicken. It's not that easy to turn into a phoenix. My mother worked as an escort in a club because she was good-looking. She had a brief relationship with William. Everyone actually knows about this. It's just that no one speaks of it openly. I lived in the county with my mother for 22 years when my mom was seriously ill. William didn't come. After my mother passed away, only a few neighbors attended the funeral. But within 3 days, the Johnson family suddenly appeared. They took me away. They said I was the daughter of a wealthy tycoon. I found this absurd. Which daughter of a billionaire wouldn't be able to come up with $1 million for surgery? Although I understand what's going on in my heart, being publicly humiliated still feels very unpleasant. I thought Alexander would look down on me for this, or distance himself from me because important people were present. He acted as if he hadn't heard those comments at all. He bent down to help me adjust my dress. He smiled gently and said, "Alina, be careful when going down the steps." He was the first person to show me kindness, but I felt even sadder and more embarrassed inside. Looking back now, perhaps it was because he was gentle and refined at that time, as bright as the moon in the sky, while I was stuck in the mud. I felt ashamed and awkward, and timid due to my inferiority. "Alina." The sound of the hairdryer stopped. Alexander's gentle voice was a bit hoarse. He pulled me out of my memories. He was still wearing that outfit that showed off his figure from the office, showcasing strong muscles and a slim waist clearly. I came back to my senses. I looked at him with a bit of confusion. Alexander pressed his lips together, his eyes slightly lowered. "You just now, what were you thinking?" I couldn't help but chuckle. I gently held his hand resting on his knee. I squeezed it. I said, "I was thinking, Alexander is still as considerate as before. He knows I like it this way. He dressed up like this to make me happy." Alexander's face suddenly turned red. He looked at me angrily. He seemed like he wanted to say something but didn't. It looked like he wanted to say something but held back. Just when I thought he was too shy to speak, he suddenly mumbled out a sentence. "I'm not young anymore. Indeed, I can't compare to those young and strong male models." This statement carried a strong sense of jealousy. I leaned on his leg, pretending to think. I'm very satisfied with the person Alexander chose. I have always trusted your judgment." Alexander was very angry to hear that, but he still held my hand tightly. He stared at me. His gaze gradually deepened. There was an indescribable emotion in his eyes. I smiled gently. I looked up and kissed those familiar lips. Alexander is not simple. I understand him better than anyone. He appears so gentle and polite on the surface, but he's just as difficult to deal with emotionally. That night, We had a wonderful time, this body, this person, I have missed for 3 whole years, when the Johnson family suddenly took me back. It wasn't because William had a change of heart or a delayed paternal love. They just wanted me to marry in place of Elizabeth. There's a young master from the wealthy Smith family in New York. He's only 16. He became a vegetable due to a car accident. Experts both domestically and internationally have no solution. Later, a reclusive master pointed out, the young master's fate is too weak. They need to find a person with a strong fate to stabilize it, and it must be a match in social status. The Smith family has no choice. They can only try this method. So they collected the birth dates of noble young ladies nationwide. If fate allows, they will become relatives. The Smith family is willing to give away shares of Smith Group 3 for free. Elizabeth's name is on the list, but she firmly refuses to marry a minor. Rather than calling it a marriage, it's more about bringing good fortune. Mrs. Johnson certainly cannot bear to let her beloved daughter, who she has cherished for over 20 years, suffer such a plight. My nominal father, who is greedy for power and wealth, is also unwilling to see the shares he is about to obtain just disappear. So, he remembered that he has an illegitimate daughter like me who is out in the world. Just in time, my birth date is more suitable than Elizabeth's. The daughter is safe and the shares are secured. Everyone is happy, but throughout the entire process, no one cared about my feelings. Maybe they were worried I would leave. In the first 2 months after moving to the Johnsons' house, they kept all the news from me. They told me nothing. During that time, I got very close to Alexander. Not only is he handsome, but he's also gentle and considerate. He knows how to maintain appropriate distance. Being with him felt very comfortable. It's hard for any woman to resist someone like him. We naturally ended up together. Our feelings ran deep. We often embraced. But it wasn't long before the Johnson family found out about it. They were very angry. They locked me in the house and wouldn't let me have any contact with the outside world. A week later, I was forcibly taken to the wedding car. Mrs. Johnson was wearing a mink coat. She coldly stared at me and said, he stared at me coldly and said, being able to enter the Smith house is a huge blessing for you. If you know what's good for you, don't forget the kindness the Johnson family has shown you. Elizabeth giggled softly, covering her mouth. Don't worry, sister. I will help you explain it to Alexander. To have the opportunity to spend a night with the young lady of the Smith family, he should feel honored. William was full of confidence. He let out a cold snort upon hearing this. He appeared very disdainful. Alexander is simply no match for the Smith family. He doesn't even have the right to carry the Smith family's shoes. They trample on my dignity without any consideration, and they humiliated Alexander as well. I still remember their disgusting expressions back then, and that black Bentley that followed the wedding car, from Haicheng to New York, from day to night. It followed all the way, until we reached the Smith family. I didn't look back when I entered the door. Alexander also never got out of the car. I had just arrived at the Smith family. The Smith family was not very friendly towards me. During the tea ceremony, the mother of the young master of the Smith family, she is my nominal mother-in-law. She always has a stern face. She said, I know you had a boyfriend before. I don't want to ask too much about the past, but now that you are in the Smith family, you must follow the rules. If we find out you did anything that tarnishes the family's reputation, we will not let it slide easily. I silently endured. There was no argument. What I don't understand is why there are fathers who treat their daughters as commodities to be traded. Why can Elizabeth be pampered like a treasure, without suffering any grievances? I'm a leaner, destined for a bad fate. At that time, the seeds of resentment had already begun to take root in my heart. I lived in the Smith family for half a year. Ethan's condition started to improve. The Smith family was particularly happy. They were more sincere towards me. A year later, Ethan could already feel external stimuli. He could also respond to what his family said. Tears flowed and fingers moved. I can handle these little things. I have finally freed myself from my restraints. I have ended that cautious way of living. Mrs. Smith said, the Smith family doesn't keep idle people. Even if you are the young mistress of the Smith family, you cannot just hide at home doing nothing all day. She took me to social events, to meet the wealthy ladies and socialites of New York. She personally introduced me to the Smith Group to help me understand the business world. Ethan taught me the etiquette of socialites and the art of language. This was her reward for taking care of me seriously. I was like a sponge, absorbing every opportunity to learn this knowledge. 3rd year, Ethan finally woke up. By that time, He was already 19 years old, but due to lying in bed for a long time, he was very weak. He looked as thin and small as a 14 or 15-year-old. The Smith family was both surprised and delighted. The house was as lively as Thanksgiving. The Smith family was worried that Ethan's body couldn't handle the excitement. I didn't tell him about the marriage of convenience. Ethan knows nothing about this. He only respects and cares for me like a sister. Later on, Mrs. Smith sought me out alone. She scrutinized my face carefully. She looked for quite a while. Then she suddenly said, "You look like her. You resemble that half-sister of yours a bit, but your personalities are completely different." I didn't understand her meaning, so I didn't rush to respond. She gave a cold smile. Her tone became sharp. She stared directly at me. She asked, "You really hate them, don't you? Do you want to take revenge?" My heart tightened. My hand formed a fist under the table. How could I not hate them? In these 3 years, every time I think of the day I married into the Smith family, the car that has been parked at the corner of the outer courtyard, and that figure, it makes me feel uneasy inside. And that suffocating feeling of losing freedom, like being trapped in a cage, it makes me unable to eat or sleep well. But I don't understand. There is no animosity between the Smiths and the Johnsons. Why would Mrs. Smith want to help me? Until she told me a truth I had never considered. Ethan became like that. It was because Elizabeth hit him. William thought he could deceive the Smiths. He really took himself too seriously. You have harmed my son like this. Now you want to randomly find someone to take the blame, as if nothing ever happened. Stop dreaming. When she talked about these things, the hatred on her face was deeper than mine. Just the fact that Elizabeth fled the scene. The Smiths have countless reasons to make things difficult for me. The Johnsons are really too much. Not only do they make me take responsibility for the marriage, but they also make me silently bear the resentment of the Smiths. The suffering I've endured is all because they are too selfish. However, they might not have expected the Smiths to be so clear-headed. I still don't understand. Dealing with the Johnsons was supposed to be simple for the Smiths. Why wait until now? Mrs. Smith smiled faintly. For the Johnson family, compared to the Smiths, being completely suppressed by a bastard child, living humbly in front of those they once looked down on, this is the most mentally torturous ordeal. I understand now. She nurtured me with care, not just to help me, but to use the knife she honed herself, to deal with the Johnson family, she believes. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I smiled faintly. I raised my coffee to signal her. Then thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Smith sighed. It's been 3 years. Eleanor, you are finally free. Yes, I am free. I will carry deep longing and full resentment to judge the Johnsons in the name of revenge. Eleanor. Ellie, I suddenly woke up from a dream. Fine beads of sweat appeared on my forehead. My shirt was completely soaked. Alexander turned on the bedside lamp. He took a tissue to help wipe the sweat off my face and neck. His eyes were filled with concern. It took me a long time to calm the tight pain in my chest. He seemed to have something to ask, but for a moment he didn't know how to say it. I took a deep breath. Go ahead. It's nothing. I just dreamed about some past events. The dream felt so real. It was as if I relived 3 years' worth of experiences. But at 25, I have already gotten used to bearing everything alone. Alexander quietly looked at me. He didn't ask much more. He just said somewhat sadly, Ellie, you have changed. Alexander, people always change. If I hadn't changed, how could I possibly have such achievements now? The atmosphere is a bit awkward. I smiled faintly. I leaned close and gently kissed his ear. You've changed too. You weren't the type to play tricks before. Alexander looked away. In the end, he bit my face in frustration, this man. Now he has become like a loyal dog. I secretly felt relieved. 3 years after parting, I returned. He was still waiting for me, seeing him all alone. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Half a year ago, the Smith family publicly announced the end of my fake marriage with Ethan. They also recognized me as their goddaughter. They generously allowed me to use the Smith family's resources and connections. They often gave me advice and secretly helped me. I had just returned to Haicheng not long ago, and I heard that Alexander's company was about to go under. So I immediately sent someone to investigate. It turned out to be just minor issues. There was really nothing urgent. I was thinking about where this rumor came from. I just received a report from my subordinate. They said the Smith family is competing for a project we're handling. That's when I started to understand. Some people have ulterior motives. At first, I pretended to know nothing. I kept silent until one morning, I opened the villa door. I saw a man who looked a bit like Alexander standing at the entrance. He politely greeted me. "Hello, Eleanor," I asked. "Who are you?" He didn't speak. Instead, he smiled and lifted his hoodie, revealing 2 prominent canine teeth. "Sister, look, I have 8-pack abs," I gasped in surprise. Helplessly, I closed my eyes. I waved my hand at him, meaning for him to leave. He tearfully tugged at my shirt hem and said, "All right, I'll be honest. Sister, please don't chase me away. Is that okay?" he said shyly. "Alexander sent me to get close to you," I thought to myself. This excuse is really weak. This tactic is too obvious. I reflected on it for a moment. It was both frustrating and amusing. I thought about it. Let that person wait at the door. I went inside and wrote a check for 100,000. "Brother, go back and tell Alexander. I let you in to chat for an hour. We had a great conversation. Do you understand?" He took the check. His eyes lit up. He nodded repeatedly. Then he asked again, "If he asks about the project, how should I respond?" I smiled lightly. I said, "This isn't sincere enough. I need to think it over some more." The man left happily. That night, a familiar number appeared on my phone screen. I deliberately waited for a moment. I only picked up when the call was about to disconnect. "Hello, may I ask who it is?" There was silence on the other end of the phone for a moment. Only slow breathing could be heard. I remained silent. On the other side of the computer screen, the conference room was filled with people. In the video, John called my name anxiously. "Eleanor." The call was suddenly disconnected. All I heard was the busy signal. Thanks to John's clever arrangements, things progressed faster than expected. I suppressed my inner excitement. "Let's continue the meeting," John reported. "The scattered shares we recently acquired have already given us control of 48% of Johnson Group's shares. This exceeds the total of William, Elizabeth, and Victoria's shares combined, according to the shareholder agreement of Johnson Group. William's position as chairman must be removed. There are 2 ways. First, continue acquiring shares, ensure control of 51% of the shares. Secondly, conduct a vote." I looked down at the pile of documents on my desk. I thought for a moment. I slowly said, "The remaining shareholders. Many of them are long-time employees who have worked at Johnson Group for years. They are unlikely to sell their shares easily. Moreover, in terms of numbers, we don't hold any advantage. It seems William is relying on this point. That's why he still has such confidence now." John thought for a moment. He reminded seriously, "What Smith means overall is, if the situation requires, some strong measures can be taken. The strong measures mentioned here actually refer to what Mrs. Smith mentioned before returning to Haicheng, addressing the root of the problem. Who is the core of the board? The shareholders. If some shareholders cannot arrive on time due to external reasons, for them, the chances of winning would be even greater. In business competition, it is not uncommon to occasionally use some less than glorious tactics." I smiled faintly. "Tell him, this matter is up to you now." John let out a sigh of relief. He nodded in agreement. The next day, I ran into William in the lobby of the Johnson Group. As soon as he saw me, his expression immediately turned ugly. He was so agitated that it seemed he was about to rush over and hit me. Even when held back by my bodyguard, he kept cursing nonstop. "Eleanor, how could I have a daughter like you? The Johnson family lets you live well with the Smiths, and this is how you repay us." I couldn't help but laugh, enjoying life. Elizabeth knocked someone unconscious. "Do you still expect the Smith family to repay kindness with kindness?" William's angry expression suddenly turned panicked. He looked around nervously. I sneered at him. "What are you afraid of? I already know everything. Did you think the Smith family would be kept in the dark by you? What exactly do you want to do?" "I want your family to leave the Johnson Group. I want you to suffer immensely. I want you to pay with your life for my mom." I took a deep breath, trying hard to suppress the anger inside me. I raised my head and closed my eyes. That day, when I had an honest conversation with Mrs. Smith, I told her that I found my mom's death somewhat suspicious and asked her to help investigate. My mom had stomach cancer and lung cancer. She also suffered from various illnesses due to long-term fatigue. The doctor clearly said she could hold on for a while longer. But in the time it took me to get a kettle of water, when I returned to the ward, she had already passed away. I didn't think much of it at first. I just felt it was fate. The Johnson family appeared at a very opportune time. When the investigation results came out, there were indeed problems. It turned out that the nurse at the hospital back then was bribed. They added other medications to my mom's Roman 4. This caused a sudden heart attack, leading to her death. It was William who ordered it. He was eager to bring me back to the Johnson family. He wants me to take the blame for Elizabeth, and he thinks my mom is a burden. He's also afraid I won't cooperate because I can't bear to part with my mom. So, he simply cut off all ties. When I learned the truth, I was so angry that I was shaking. In the eyes of someone like William, human life is as worthless as grass. To achieve his goals, he dares to use any means. The current Aliner is no longer the fool who can be easily manipulated. The Johnson family, you all just wait and see. The male model thing didn't work out, plus John's little incident. Alexander couldn't hold back. He soon took the initiative to reach out. He found an excuse related to work and asked to meet me at a restaurant. It had been 3 years since we last met. He was still the same as before, still gentle and composed. We silently stared at each other for a long time. There were many things I wanted to say, but in the end, no one brought up the past. He finally couldn't hold back. He pretended to browse the menu. His tone was somewhat stiff. "Leaner, I've arranged to meet you today. It's about discussing the North Dock project." I'm resting my chin on my hand. I asked with great interest, "Oh, did that little duck not tell you what I said?" Alexander was taken aback for a moment, but he insisted on explaining. "I'm sincere. I pretended to be uninterested. Go ahead. He's too young, not my type." I interrupted his words. I said with a smile, "I think Alexander still has charm. Why don't you come in person? Let me truly experience your sincerity." Alexander probably didn't expect me to tease him so directly in front of so many people. He was so surprised that he trembled. He knocked over the water cup. He hurriedly cleaned up and occasionally stole glances at me. His eyes were filled with confusion and unease. I think the effect is about the same now, so I didn't continue to press further. After the meeting the next day, I returned to the office. I planned to go to the lounge to change into clean clothes. As I just pushed open the door, I saw Alexander wearing a rabbit officer uniform. He was lying on the bed with a stiff expression. He struck a dramatic pose. I was stunned. The subordinates behind me, who accidentally saw this scene, were also shocked. Everyone collectively gasped. Their eyes shifted back and forth between me and Alexander, clearly filled with curiosity. Alexander was still unconsciously fiddling with the white rabbit tail on his tailbone. Now not only was his expression stiff, but he looked completely frozen as well. Eleanor, he was incredibly angry. He quickly pulled the blanket over himself tightly. Not even a strand of hair was showing. It was then that I realized the situation. I hurriedly closed the lounge door. He waved his hand, trying to appear calm. "Let those who are inexplicably excited go out first. We'll talk about the plan later. You all can leave first. This is truly an extremely embarrassing situation. I never expected this at all." The usually gentle and shy Alexander actually managed to lower himself, prepared such an unexpected surprise for me. This is really a huge embarrassment. The aloof and cool image I've been trying to maintain. I'm afraid it's going to be ruined from today onward. I touched my nose. I walked to the bedside. I pulled the blanket and said, "All right, now there's no one around." He slowly moved a bit, reluctantly poked his head out. He lifted the blanket and sat up. His eyes were red. His originally fair cheeks were burning hot, as if they could fry an egg. It was not just anger. He also felt particularly embarrassed. My heart is beating especially fast. I quickly cleared my throat. I said, trying to act calm, I understood Alexander's feelings. Alexander lowered his head. He asked softly, and then I took a room card out of my pocket. I slipped it into his collar. I leaned closer and said to him, "So, the project is yours, and you are mine now." Alexander stared at me for a moment. Then he suddenly got closer. He held my neck with one hand and kissed my lips fiercely. His kiss was filled with intense longing and relief. I closed my eyes. My nose tinged with sadness, and tears still fell down. Alexander was the same, just like that. The story returned to the initial scene. When I woke up, I found him holding me. Sunlight streamed in through the gap in the curtains. It fell on his face. That face, I've been missing it every day. Time seems to have stopped all of a sudden. Last night, I still felt like I was dreaming, but now, I know clearly, he really is back by my side. He suddenly opened his eyes. Our eyes met. "Good morning." In the morning, the man's voice sounded a bit deep and hoarse. We couldn't help but laugh after several twists and turns. Alexander and I finally got back together. In public, he still maintains his gentle, humble, and polite image, but in private, he is even more dependent on me than before, while competing with William. I'm also finding time to date amidst the busyness. John secretly observed for several days. In the end, he couldn't help but carefully speak up. Leaner. About the matters with the board. Should we continue to push it forward? I frowned and asked, why not? He let out a sigh of relief. He seemed much more relaxed. I looked at the female protagonists in the novels. No matter how deep the resentment was in the past, once nurtured by love, the heart softens. You forget the pain of the past. I pouted. I wanted to say something but couldn't get the words out. In the end, I helplessly patted his shoulder and said, John, try to read fewer of those exaggerated online novels from now on. My relationship with Alexander is our own business. The feud with the Johnson family is another matter. The two do not affect each other. Besides, I know that the resentment Alexander has harbored in his heart over the past 3 years is no less than mine. He is just gentle by nature, easy to be content. But I am different. I am someone who seeks revenge for wrongs. John was sent by Mrs. Smith to help me. He is very reliable. The shareholders' meeting on Monday will be held as scheduled. There should have been 49 participants. In the end, only 27 people showed up, and most of them are from my side. The Johnson family, who were full of confidence when they first arrived, started to panic. They stared at me, angrily questioning, Eleanor, is this your doing? I shrugged helplessly, let out a sigh. Chairman William, please don't blame me casually. Those people had things at home and couldn't come. It has nothing to do with me. Elizabeth screamed loudly. She rushed towards me angrily. It must be you. You ungrateful person. Her hand was about to strike down. Suddenly, it was caught by a large hand. I looked up in surprise. It was a bit unexpected. Alexander, what are you doing here? Alexander forcefully shook off Elizabeth's hand, took out a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his hands, then disdainfully threw it into the trash can. He looked a bit angry. Her gaze is cold and icy. Elizabeth, it's better to be polite when speaking. You're acting so arrogantly just because you're the daughter of the richest man. Soon, no one will be willing to tolerate you. Elizabeth was momentarily stunned. William and Victoria also frowned. They appeared somewhat uneasy. They asked, what do you mean by that? Moreover, this is the shareholders' meeting of Johnson Group. How did you, an outsider, get in here? Security. Where is the security actually? I'm quite curious too. When we were together last night, Alexander didn't mention coming today at all. He ignored the others. He simply waved his hand to his assistant behind him. The assistant immediately understood his meaning. He quickly handed out a document to each of the shareholders present. Alexander looked down at me. With a gentle smile on his lips, he said loudly, Old man Richard has already transferred his 4% shares of Johnson Group to me. According to the shareholder agreement established by Johnson Group, I am naturally qualified to attend this meeting. I blinked. I struggled to recall and finally remembered this person. I had visited him a few times with John before, but that old man is particularly stubborn. He says he is too old. He doesn't want to get involved in young people's affairs. However, at that time, we had already decided to use Mrs. Smith's Plan B. Whether the shareholding exceeds half is no longer that critical, so we didn't push him anymore. How could someone who just said they would remain absolutely neutral quickly transfer shares to others? Alexander noticed my confusion. He lowered his head and explained with a smile. That's my grandfather. Now, the outcome is already very clear, John announced with a smile, because Mrs. Eleanor holds more than half of the shares. We can skip the voting process. It has now been decided to remove William from the chairman position. Eleanor will take over. This is impossible. William seems unable to accept this blow. Staggering back 2 steps, her face turned pale. If it weren't for Victoria supporting her beside her, she might have already fallen. Elizabeth, the spoiled young lady, was stunned. She stared blankly at me and Alexander. You are seeking revenge. You are getting back at me for my dad breaking you up back then. I couldn't help but sigh, suddenly realizing she was truly raised by William. Even her selfishness is exactly the same. She really is hopeless. But forget it. None of this matters anymore. After today, everything will be over. William's lips trembled. He pointed at me but couldn't say a word. Victoria, however, took on the demeanor of a wealthy wife. She threw down a harsh warning to me. Don't celebrate too early, it won't be long. We will definitely get back what we lost. Really, I smiled and narrowed my eyes. Just wait and see. The farce ultimately ended with the Johnson family leaving in disgrace. I gave a meaningful smile. How could I give them a chance to retaliate like flies? They just wouldn't let go. They were driven away only to come back. The best way is, of course, to resolve things as soon as they arise. I gave John a knowing glance. John nodded slightly. He quietly left. Alexander seemed to sense something. He watched John leave, then turned to look at me. I calmly met his gaze for a moment. He suddenly raised his hand and hugged me. Say it. Alina is really impressive. Ellie, no matter what happens, I will always be by your side. I lowered my head, leaning against his chest, not saying a word. Half an hour later, a few news stories suddenly trended. The chairman of Johnson Group has been replaced. The new chairman is a leaner. William had a car accident on his way home. The car they were in was on a necessary route. They suddenly encountered an out-of-control truck. Due to brake failure, their car was knocked several meters away. The truck driver was a foreigner. He died on the spot in the accident. The Johnson family of 3 was urgently sent to the hospital for rescue. The current situation is unclear. I sat in the office chair, listening quietly to the news report on my phone. John pushed the door open and came in. He casually closed the door behind him. He hesitated and glanced at Alexander standing behind me. He said softly, "Alina, the hospital arrangements have all been made." He paused. It seemed he was worried I might misunderstand. Then he explained, "That accident was not arranged by Smith. It really was just an accident." I didn't say anything. Alexander waved his hand to let John leave. After the office door closed again, he sighed. "Ask me, have you softened your heart?" I thought about it, shakes head. "It's not that I've softened. I'm just a bit lost. I originally thought I would feel a rush of relief after taking revenge, now that it's finally happened, but I'm not as happy as I imagined." Alexander said directly, "Because William is your biological father. He is your only relative in this world. If he dies in the car accident, you suddenly lose your support. You would feel unsettled." Although I was somewhat reluctant, but I have to admit, he is not wrong, although I hold some resentment towards William. His blood runs through my veins. That is an unchangeable fact. John and I originally planned to hire someone to kidnap Elizabeth. We wanted to see what outrageous things Victoria and William would do for her. But before we could take action, things took an unexpected turn. This incident caught everyone off guard. Alexander patted my head and squatted down. "Our eyes are level. Don't worry, Ellie, I'm here for you," John told me. "Mrs. Smith has already made arrangements at the hospital. I can almost guess her plan. Even though Ethan has woken up, the nerves in his right leg are dead. He can barely exert any strength. As a mother, she cannot accept that the perpetrator lives freely as if nothing happened. She not only wants Elizabeth to pay the price, but also wants the Johnson family to experience the pain Ethan has suffered. Let them experience the torment themselves." The 3 members of the Johnson family all survived, but their lives are worse than death. William became a cerebral palsy patient due to a car accident. He lost the ability to speak. No matter how much treatment he receives, he can only make indistinct sounds. He constantly drools. Elizabeth had her right leg amputated. Victoria's injuries are relatively minor. She fractured 2 ribs. She also suffered a concussion and cerebral hemorrhage. Half a month later, I went to the hospital to visit with Alexander. We happened to catch them arguing and pulling at each other in the ward. Victoria blamed Elizabeth for running away after the accident. If Ethan had been taken to the hospital in time back then, the Johnson family wouldn't have ended up like this. Elizabeth complained that she and William were incapable. Even I, as a young girl, couldn't handle it. The 2 of them were at an impasse. As they talked, they started fighting. It was truly a farce of mutual conflict. Look, that's human nature. Once one is hurt, love becomes selfish. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned and went to William's ward. William was lying in bed. The muscles in his face twitched from time to time. Saliva dripped down from the corner of his mouth. He looked quite disheveled. It seemed like there was something wrong with his brain. But when he saw me, he still trembled and made some indistinct sounds. I initially wanted to feel sympathy for him, but just thinking about how my mom lies alone in the hospital bed, lifeless, that little sympathy vanishes without a trace. Alexander grabbed a chair from the side. He let me sit down. I looked at William's awkward state. I said slowly, "I sold all my shares in the Johnson Group at a low price. I invested the money in the stock market. And what happened? It was all gone overnight." William was agitated. He made strange sounds. I continued to speak. "By the way, you left in a hurry that day. The company's legal representative hasn't been changed yet. Now the company is suspected of illegal fundraising. All the assets of the Johnson family have been frozen. It won't be long. Your family of 3 might not even be able to pay for hospital fees. I slowly told him about my recent achievements. The purpose was to see, after losing the halo of being the richest man, what kind of person he really is. Ellie, Alexander called me softly. His fingers were a bit cold. They gently brushed the corner of my eye. That's when I realized I had unknowingly been crying. I took a deep breath. I watched William struggling on the hospital bed, unable to move. Suddenly, I felt a sense of relief. The era of the richest man in Haicheng has come to an end. Next, let's just wait for time to handle everything. I walked out of the hospital. I took a deep breath of fresh air. Then, quite naturally, I held Alexander's hand. I said, "Let's go. Next, I'm going to enjoy the life I fought hard to regain."